We're going to start here with Dessima Williams, but before we do that, I want to make sure everybody knows who's sitting beside me. So we have Dessima Williams, we have Kelley, Kizzier, not Kizzier, Kizzier, Rodrigo Andrade, and Thomas Kerr from IFC, the government of Chile, and from co-chair of Article 6 from Ireland, but co-chair of Article 6 in the UNFCCC. So before we move over here, we're going to start with Dessima Williams, who's been steeped in these negotiations for a very long time and is now not in the negotiations, but has such a wealth of experience that we thought you could give us sort of the biggest, broadest view of why we're here, how we landed in in Bonn. But before we go there, maybe you could just give us a little bit of background of yourself. Who are you, and why are you here in COP23?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this open community conversation, online community. I have to get used to the new IT world. I'm a Caribbean person. My home is in Grenada, and I've spent many years working on regional and issues of the South, the Southern Hemisphere. So I've been most recently a climate change negotiator, starting off in Copenhagen, and I've been a diplomat from Grenada as an ambassador to the United Nations for several years, in which capacity I then chaired the group of 44 island countries from around the world. And more recently, Tracy, you and I have been working with the president of the General Assembly last year, and my unique role was to coordinate the president's response to Sustainable Development Goals, which is the global agenda for everybody, to transform our world more towards more durable, long-lasting, peaceful, equitable, and happy world.
Yeah.
So I've come through, diplomacy, development, and the search for, well-being.
Absolutely. And so I always forget to introduce myself. My name's Tracy Raczek, and we have worked together in the past.
Yes.
I'm in the UN President General Assembly's office most recently. So you were there in really pivotal moments in the global agenda, which were the creation of the Paris Climate Agreement, as well as during the Sustainable Development Agenda, which was adopted by the UN General Assembly, both of those in 2015. Can you maybe briefly describe the two of them, how they maybe complement each other, and most importantly, why are they so important? That's a lot. So you can start with what you think is most important about all of that.
I think the most important thing to say is that we have a world that has a past, a present, and a future. And the past and the present reminds us that we cannot do what we have done before if we want to maintain a future. And this is where the whole notion, the whole idea of sustainability comes to play. What we have achieved in the past is being remarkable in terms of lifting the human condition. There's no doubt about the scientific, the medical, the social, the just broad scope of cultural achievements of humankind. But the first problem is that we have done so at a great cost to the environment and to other people. And secondly, that large swaths of the world have either not benefited from or have come into that progress. Therefore, we need to do two key things which these agreements speak to. We have to revisit what we have achieved so we don't continue that same approach to achieving. That's mainly for developed countries or developed communities, developed areas of the world. Our high level of development has come at a high cost, so we have to look at that and retool it to do it better. And the second challenge is, for those who have not benefited, they too must eat 3 meals a day. They too must have decent housing. But we are not to achieve that using the old method. So those are the twin challenges: to adjust, to continue the progress, and to have new progress, but to use new methodologies. And this is where the two main conventions or treaties come in. The Paris Agreement is probably one of the most, because what it says is the way in which we have developed, we have been emitting. You know, I remember when I was a child and I was growing up with candles before we had electricity. And we had to do our homework in a candlelight, and even sometimes a regular lamp. And I would stare at the flame and wonder, where does the smoke from the flame go? I couldn't get that answer, because when the candle is lighting, you get the flame, but there's a little thin part which is the smoke or the waste. It goes up into the air and you can't see it. Well, that's the billions of emissions that we now have.
It's the black carbon.
Yes. And so the Paris Agreement helps us to understand that we get the flame of progress, but we also get the destruction of carbon, and we have to do something about it. That's one. And the other one, which is the Agenda 2030, says that in every sphere of life, we need to adjust.
And what's interesting about that story, we actually also need to adjust. That's such a telling story. It also reminds us that we need to ensure that kids today aren't reading by candlelight, and that we have access to energy, and we have a full development agenda which enables opportunity for everyone to develop and equitably and have opportunity, et cetera. So that's a beautiful reminder. I mean, I will quickly say that the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon always used to remind us that he was also raised by candlelight, and it's only a couple of generations ago that we are really facing, people have gone from incredible poverty to wealth in many regions of the world at incredible cost, and some are still living in incredible abject poverty. There's lots of work to be done. These two agendas map out the way, which is fantastic, but as you mentioned, there's lots of reviews that need to be done to make sure we're doing it. Before we pivot over here and hear a little bit about how the negotiations are moving along, is there anything you want to add about the details or any other specifics?
Well, I think that there are many agreements. I think the public must remember that many agreements. The two big ones, the Paris Agreement on climate change and the Sustainable Development Goals as part of Agenda 2030, are the biggest. But there is one on disaster risk reduction. How do we protect ourselves or prepare for this plethora of natural disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes, and so on? So that's called the Sendai Agreement. And the other one that I'm particularly attached to now is the Small Island Developing States, the group of Caribbean and Pacific countries. We have our own agreement which takes all of that into consideration in the context of small islands with small land mass and a lot of social and economic development needs still pending. So I think there is a policy tool for everybody, and then there are policy tools by sectors, geographic or thematic groups of people around the world. So everyone can do something. And I know we're here to talk about transportation. All the agreements refer implicitly or explicitly to transportation. We must adjust our mode of transportation, absolutely, whether it's in shipping, aviation, family transportation, agricultural transportation of food and so on. There is something to be done in every single sphere of life, and if you're not so creative, there's a treaty to guide you, and if you're very creative, go do it.
Absolutely, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. Excellent. It gives you faith that there are so many great policies out there that are recently shaped up to guide us in this really challenging time. So thank you for that summary. That was really well articulated. So, Kelley, Kizzier. Yeah,
not
Kelley,
bad.
Okay,
not
good.
bad.
Thank you so much. I know that it was really hard for you to join us because you are co-chairing one of the articles that are being negotiated right here at COP23. So your time is incredibly valuable. We appreciate it. Before we dig into your specific article, can you give us a general description of the landscape of the UNFCCC?
Yeah, I think I think that's very confusing to a lot of people. I mean, what we hear on the news is that there's a climate conference going on, there's 20,000 people here, and then you get these questions like, why? Paris Agreement is agreed. What's happening? And the truth is we just don't know. No, I'm joking. But
Let's
so,
go.
yeah, so that's all I have. No, so the Paris Agreement has many articles, right? And I'm a delegate from Ireland. I negotiate for the EU. So all of the countries, 196 countries that are parties to the Paris Agreement. So you'll hear many people talking about parties.
It's not a party.
It's not a party, no.
It's not a party.
It is a party-driven process. It means the countries drive the process. So countries are parties to the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement is a treaty level, so it's quite high level. And we need a rule book to understand as countries how to implement it. And so you'll see in the articles, it'll say things like, you know, elaborate guidance, rules, modalities, and procedures, guidelines. There's all these hooks for further instruction to come. And so the delegates, the parties, the countries that are here, are spending our time in rooms dedicated to each of these articles, dedicated to different topics like mitigation, finance, adaptation, transparency, carbon markets, that's what I work on, trying to elaborate these rule books. And in Paris, we set ourselves a timeline of COP24, which is a year from now, to finalize these rule books. And it is an incredibly heavy lift, because the way that these rooms work is all the parties, all the countries get together in each of these rooms to negotiate these topics. The negotiations are chaired always by two people, a developing country representative and a developed country representative, to ensure always having balance in the process. And then we have to agree. It's a consensus-based agreement. So there's no veto. I mean, sorry, there's only, every party has a veto. There's no vote.
Yeah.
You can't force any country to take on the rules that we agree. We all have to agree. And that can be very difficult because different countries have different priorities. So you can't leave half of the rule book behind because the EU has particular priorities or because AOSIS have particular priorities. We're all on the Paris train and we have to move together.
Yes.
So it's incredibly difficult coordination and
yes, it's very, and it gets very detailed. It's not only conceptual, but then you get down to minutia of negotiating specific words, which, you know, shall versus should, and
shall versus should is really very.
I'm not joking. It's
crucial.
one of the most crucial things. Right? So
shall is a legal obligation. Should is maybe.
Should. I really like it if you do. Yeah. So there's a lot of, you know, every word is very weighted, and then the co-chairs have a lot of work to do in measuring the interests of all the.
So for the last week and a half, we hear parties, and then we try and reflect what we've heard in text, and then that text is negotiated. So
and now we're about to go into the high level. All these decisions have basically been summarized and packaged, and now we're going into the final phase of the COP, which is the high level.
You get the kind of leader. So the first week is kind of civil servant level negotiations, where, you know, essentially the nerds like me sit and queue everything up for the ministerial level. And then we get the ministers take a look at that, and they only deal with high level stuff. You know, ministers aren't going to deal with very, very detailed stuff. That's not their job. And now we're going to the high level segment, and we've seen today heads of state here, you know, heads of state addressing the conference. So,
which is a good sign, actually.
It's how the work builds. And all around that is sort of the Paris show, which has civil society and NGOs and...
Right. So let's go to yours, what you do.
I co-chair Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and that's on, it's market-based mechanisms.
Yes, so which are markets specifically, not...
Carbon markets.
Carbon markets.
It doesn't, So it's the idea that parties can cooperate with one another and meet their targets more efficiently at less cost by trading, we call them ITMOs, it's terrible, internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. So if one country overachieves its target or even overachieves in one sector, it could sell that overachievement to another country, because climate change is a global problem, and so you're still reducing. And because the cost of reduction could be much, much cheaper in country A than it is in country B, we can achieve more ambition at less cost.
Right. So if, for example, maybe you want to give an example of one country has country X, let's not name names, but you could if you want maybe, has easy access to hydroelectric power or wind power, for example, and they produce more than they need, so that's extra credit for them.
If it goes beyond their nationally determined commitment.
If it goes beyond their nationally determined commitment.
Correct.
Exactly.
Then they could trade with another party that doesn't have the same sort of access to those things. Or, I mean, really the more pertinent example is countries that have a rather outdated infrastructure, right? Their reductions are typically going to be cheaper because they have so far to come through all the different technologies, the deployment, right? So, whereas a country that's already almost as efficient, best available, that next ton is going to cost them more to reduce.
Right.
So if we understand this to be a global effort, we can cooperate together using trading to achieve what we need to achieve at least cost. If we do it at least cost, we can have higher and higher ambition.
And how is that progressing? How did you find, the
Article 6?
Article 6.
Oh, it's perfect. No. I mean, we got some really good conclusions here. So essentially, our conclusions say that the chair of the body that we work for, which is called SUBSTA, the subsidiary body for science and technical advice, the chair of the SUBSTA is going to go away based on the written submissions by parties and based on the work that we did here, and he's going to write a draft negotiating text for the rule book for how parties cooperate through carbon pricing, carbon markets.
Okay. And also within your article is the concept of offsetting, which
well, sure. So
let's talk a little bit more about
that.
Yeah,
there's kind of three components. There's
Yeah.
parties cooperating in the way we're talking about, and then there is a centralized mechanism. So some people call it the Sustainable Development Mechanism. It doesn't have a name yet. But essentially there would be a board sitting at the UN level which would approve projects or sector approaches, which would approve that these actually lead to reductions. We call that a concept of additionality. They are in addition to what would have happened otherwise.
Right, and that has been a tough concept for quite some time for people who've been following the COP.
Well, sure. I mean, so the Kyoto Protocol had a mechanism, the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism.
Yeah.
And this is the Paris Agreement's version of this.
Yes.
But now we have a different context because we're in the context of the Paris Agreement, which
Yes.
is commitments by all countries, not just some countries.
Yes.
And so developing that rule set is challenging, but
challenging.
we're not starting from scratch.
Exactly.
We had a mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol, so we can take those lessons we learned earlier
and build on them.
And
that's really the gift of the good thing design element of the Paris Agreement is that everyone's involved. It's universal, so it's complex, but it needs to be
based on their
complex.
nationally determined commitments.
Exactly.
So this means that's because we have 196 countries, all with different capacities, all with different circumstance, and they could design their own commitments and then cooperate on that basis.
Exactly. And that's a perfect segue for our next guest.
Wonderful.
Oh, yes.
Maybe Rodrigo will mention it, but we must put in the point of the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Everybody's obligated, but not at the same level.
That's absolutely right.
That's
right.
a very important principle
That's
to
right.
observe. Everybody has to do something, but
It's based on your
it's based on
your
capacity. Palau, or Nauru, which is 9,000 people who did not emit, who have no real history or so, cannot then have the same obligation, let me say frankly, as Germany with 80 million persons and so on. So
Absolutely.
And a historical emissions
And a different
track.
historical.
Absolutely. CBDR. We'll throw in an acronym so people can get versed in that one. Yes. Okay. Thank you for reminding us of that. Absolutely. So our next guest is also going to remind us of the country perspective, which we were so grateful to have brought in. Rodrigo, could you tell us very quickly a bit about who you are, why you're here, and then we'll just dig right into sort of the transport commitments and world you're coming
Yes,
from.
of course. My name is Rodrigo Andrade. I am from Chile. I was invited for the Chilean government. I am not part of the Chilean government. I was invited for them to support them in some specific topics. I am here because I work in a regional organization, the regional of the civil society organization. And we have, of course, a regional view about these issues and other issues, especially sustainable development. Of course, we have a big challenge. Our region is a region that grows so fast, but we are still fighting against poverty, and we need to create a balance between the fight against poverty and the environmental cares. So this conference, this climate conference, is an opportunity to share our ambition, our problems, and to try to get some agreements and support, and I don't know, from the other countries of the world. We support the principle that the previous person mentioned. Everyone has a responsibility in that is happening in the world, but we are in different levels to create solutions for that. As you know, Latin America is a vulnerable region of the world. We are suffering. We are actually suffering the effects of the climate change. It's not theory for us. We suffer these effects every year. Always is more common, almost often. And we have a big ambition to be here and try to create the right methodology to implement the Paris Agreement.
And you mentioned, and absolutely understand, and you mentioned that sort of regional view that you talked about a little bit before is quite revolutionary. You're mentioning all of the transformation in the region that's happening for sustainability. Do you want to touch upon that a bit?
Of course, we are moving fast. I think you have listened about it, but Chile is living a solar revolution at the moment. We have the public policies, we have a very good political conditions, and in the past 10 years have been coming almost 100 different private companies to invest in renewable energy. So, as you know, Chile has the second largest solar irradiation of the world, after Arizona desert, in Atacama desert, in the north of Chile, close to our copper minings. So it's a very great news for us, because we are connecting our mining production to renewable energy.
That's fantastic.
So we are
that's great. And
our emissions are growing by.
And with transportation too, you mentioned that you have a lot of transportation revolutions happening as well. Do you want to speak to some of those examples?
We pre-launched a little study today in the morning, and we think that energy situations is a very big thing. It's a very big base to create a new system, new sustainable transport system, you know. Actually, the country, first of all, the country Chile has a new tax, a green tax, that started this year. And this tax is trying to create conditions, cultural and educational, and of course financial conditions to build this new sustainable transport system. Next year we will have a public tender for the transport system, and it's like 15% of this public tender is exclusive for electric buses. So we are moving forward to to support this new sustainable transport system.
That's fantastic. And I do wish we had more time. Unfortunately, we don't, to go into more details, but maybe at the end we can hear the concrete ideas
Yes,
for transportation. There's a lot going on, and it's really nice to hear the concrete examples you can provide for the revolution. That's fantastic. And I think Latin America always has been associated with the term revolution, so it's great. It's sustainable.
Yeah.
I love it. All right, so our next speaker, Thomas Kerr, comes from the International Finance Corporation, IFC, and maybe you can briefly explain what are you doing here at COP, and then we'll go into a bit more substance.
Sure, thank you. So yeah, IFC is the private sector part of the World Bank. We're the largest development bank that is exclusively focused on the private sector. And I'm here because I think we talked about the Paris Agreement, we talked about these national contributions, these commitments that were made, and we see that sent a clear signal to the private sector, a low carbon transition is coming. So that's a market signal, and we see that as a business opportunity. So we just talked about electric buses. We're very interested in talking with you about that, and I think many of our clients will be as well. So I think we look at this as such as, first, the emissions that we see, growth that we see in the future, the infrastructure that's needed is, the lion's share of that is in the emerging markets where we operate. Secondly, most of that money is going to have to come from the private sector, again, the lion's share. And so we feel very well placed to sort of translate what's happening here in Bonn and with the Paris Agreement into the terms that investors can think about. So last year we did a study, for example. We looked at 23 of the NDCs, these commitments that were made, and we assumed that they were across all these sectors, and we assumed that the country would achieve their target. And we said, well, how much money does that represent in terms of investment opportunity? Let's flip it into, okay, this could be an investment opportunity. The amount was $23 trillion.
For those 23?
For those 23 countries, 21 countries was 23 trillion. So that starts a conversation with the government about creating markets. So how you want to attract private sector for that commitment. What kind of policies are needed? We just heard about a carbon tax. That's a great start, and Kelley's working on that as well. There's other things around public-private partnerships. There's performance standards, other sorts of public finance that can be used. But then there's also new business models and innovation. So I'm here at COP to try to actually listen to the NDC, people that are making progress in the NDCs, and then come in and say, well, where can we offer financing?
That's fantastic. And so you're almost like a broker, for lack of a better word. But there's a lot of terms out there that we're hearing about blended finance, about leveraging finance. You primarily work in private finance.
Correct.
And I think there's been a lot of conversation in the climate finance world that we need 100 billion annually by 2020. That was the commitment made in Copenhagen, and we're aiming for that. How much of that's public, how much private, et cetera.
Right.
You work in private. Can you sort of explain for those of us who've been following the finance world, what does leveraging finance mean? What is blended finance? And how much of it can we count on?
Right. Well, okay, starting with the 100 billion, that
Show me the money, something like this.
Show me the money. Jerry Maguire. That's right. So
you're doing a great job. We just kind of, it's really about, what are we really talking about?
Right. So I think the interesting thing to talk about is, so we have that 100 billion commitment, and that is public funds from developed to developing countries. But when you look at the investment that's needed over the next several decades, it's in the trillions. So we're not talking about billions, we're talking about trillions. But the good news is that battery costs, solar costs, wind costs are dropping rapidly. And so it becomes much more of we need to use public money for some very important things like adaptation, resilience, and for some of the technologies that need it. But in a lot of these cases, we're finding in our client countries that solar and batteries is cheaper than doing it with fossil. We just did a project in Mozambique where it was labeled an adaptation and a resilience project because it's diversifying their mix from hydro. Instead of importing fossil fuels, they're going to build a solar park. And that's profitable. It's cheaper than it would have been to import the fossil fuels. And so I think the blended finance or these leveraging, I think the way to look at it is there are some commercial terms that we are very interested in, but there's also some times when a project is either in a new country or in a new technology, and it may need a little bit of assistance to get it over the finish line, to make it attractive for the private sector. And so then you can use concessional finance, blended finance, and you're using $1, for example, of public finance might leverage another $10 of private. So that's sort of that concept.
I think that's really the nugget of it, is where you have to use one to get the other.
Right.
You have to use a little bit of public to get the private,
right.
typically, right? Okay, and it's in those tough situations where private doesn't want to go alone, public can't go alone.
Right.
So you need the combination to solve that finance issue. So that's a really good point. And as costs go down with solar, wind, et cetera, it isn't a 1-for-1 ratio anymore where the dollar means the same thing as it used to, thankfully, because costs are going down.
And the one final thing I'll just say is I think we just did a study called Creating Markets for Climate Business. It looked at 7 of the key sectors, including transport. And just to focus on transport, because that's the audience,
yes.
Some fantastic business models are coming up from the bottom up. So you've heard, everybody knows Uber. There is an Uber for trucks now called Huashbang in China,
yes.
and one called Black Buck in India, where they're using a freight center, and they're basically using logistics support and IT to maximize so these trucks don't idle and waste fuel, and they don't deliver the truck and then have an empty truck coming back. They can actually work with the internet to pick up another load and ship it, and they're doing hundreds of thousands of trips each day, saving a lot of fossil fuel. So that's a business model we're investing in. There's also a lot of light rail, electric vehicles. I mean, the list goes on in terms of transport solutions that the private sector is interested in. So I think that's also something we think about, is how do you tailor this to the emerging market context with these new sort of ideas.
Absolutely, and I think there's a lot of potential there, and it's really great to see IFC and so many other actors in the IFI, international finance institution, in the finance community, really paying attention to this world, including around risk assessment and just paying attention to the climate equation overall. We can take maybe a couple quick comments before I ask that one transport question, which I'm asking all my guests, but because I can tell there's some bubbling interest.
I wanted to say one thing to complement what has been said at this end of the stage, and that is we need to accept that it is possible now to do economic development and to do good climate policy. They go hand in hand because of the cost of infrastructure, particularly energy, that is coming down. So we could industrialize or retrofit or whatever we have to do in the industrial or the development or the infrastructure world without burning a lot of fossils and getting into a high carbon scenario. So that in the field of transportation and in every other sector, it is possible to invest and to grow the economy without increasing carbon. And I think that's the model. Whether you're currently developed, you have to change, or whether you're on the development road, you have to get rid of poverty. That is the good news global framework.
Yeah, decoupling growth, right? It used to be that as your economy grew, emissions automatically grew, and now we're seeing really concrete examples where economies are growing and they're decoupling that growth from carbon emissions, and that's a very promising sign. We can take questions from the audience in 1 second, and we also can add #WeAreTransport.
Sorry.
One more.
I guess my thought would be, I mean, we hear about the money that's required to achieve what we need to achieve in terms of climate change, and carbon markets, carbon pricing approaches can reduce that cost. But I just want to disabuse everyone of the notion that you could buy your way out, that any sector, including transport, could just buy reductions from other sectors. It's clear in study after study, and the science shows that all sectors have to contribute if we're going to meet our shared goals.
Yeah.
And so we need to meet them at lowest cost, but every sector has to.
There's no get out of jail.
There's no get out of jail free card.
Yeah. Any other final comments before we go?
I would want to say this economical sector, transport, is a big issue in Latin America. As you know, Latin America has the biggest cities of the world. I don't know, Sao Paulo in Brazil has almost 25 million people in the urban sector, place. Mexico City has almost 21 million people. Bogotá, almost 15. Buenos Aires. Santiago de Chile, the population of the country is 17 million people, but in Santiago, in the capital city, lives 7 million people. So it's a big, big issue, and we need, of course, public policies, but investments, of course.
Absolutely, absolutely are needed. Do you mind if I go to the questions from the audience,
Wonderful.
and then we'll do a wrap-up question? Thanks. Okay, so we have one question here.
Hello, good morning everyone, and thanks for this interesting discussion. My name is Antoine, I'm a member of SLoCaT, and we see that there are interesting developments but there are different legs of transport, and the financing is more interested in probably in parts of transport where there are quick deployments and quick developments, and maybe more focused in the urban transport side. But when we think about the development of transport, it's also a question of the massive flows. Because there will be there is the last mile, or there is urban transport, but there is also, let's say, the main trunk of transport. And there is a question of is it interesting to think about public or even international guarantees to ease, for instance, to lower the risk and the interest rate, so due to the de-risking, because we have seen that in mechanisms in energy, renewable energy, and why not in transport?
So I had a bit of a difficulty hearing that, but I think it was about the last mile transport. What is the investment opportunities in the last mile? Very quickly, summarize your question.
Sorry.
Very quickly.
Do you think a mechanism of guarantee for public transport or collective transport would be interesting from a private finance point of view, mostly for rail or public transport?
I still couldn't hear that.
A mechanism of guarantee.
I think,
okay.
I think I understand. I can try to.
Thank you.
I definitely think that there are cases. So a good example of this sort of last mile, or the more urban, is again with the battery costs coming down. We're seeing in India. We're seeing the electric tuk-tuks, or the electric sort of rickshaws that are much more attractive than the ones that are burning the really heavily polluting fuels. And we hear every day in the news about the air pollution, and I think it's also a sort of a double win. So the Indian government has now come out with a standard to retrofit and to replace these sorts of vehicles, and those go outside of the urban areas as well. But I think in terms of the financing mechanism, I think it's a question of just aggregating those small investments into something that's large enough, and I think you could use a de-risking mechanism if that's
promising.
applicable.
That's nice. Okay, one more quick question, and then we'll wrap up here.
I'm Manuel de Araújo, and I am a mayor from Quelimane City in Mozambique. I have two questions for the gentleman from the IMF, because I would like, first of all, if you could give more details about this project, because it's not well known in Mozambique. I'm a mayor, and I can confess that I wasn't aware of this project. So I would be very happy if you could give us more details on that. My second question is that the IMF suspended its financial support to the Mozambican government due to lack of transparency in the borrowing. So I would like to know if the project that you mentioned will continue receiving support from the IFC, given that the IFC is the branch of the IMF. And thirdly and finally, I wanted really to make an appeal so that you are more open and more transparent in what you do in the countries, so that people can support the good work that you are doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that question. So the project is called the Mokuba Solar Plant. I think it's getting up to 1 gigawatt solar plant, and it was just awarded recently this year, the past few months. And it's one of these ones that uses a blended finance, so we have some concessional finance. If you want to read more, there's actually a case study of this project in this Creating Markets for Climate Business report. It's on ifc.org on our homepage right now. And I take your point about maybe publicizing this more in your own country. We just came out with this report, and I think the project was just awarded the past few months. So I'm imagining that will probably be a next step, is to make sure that the word is spread and there's good knowledge about that.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the really good questions, and wish we had more time. So we're going to, good segue for transport, because our final question that I ask every guest is the same, and then you don't have to expect to have the answer that's, everything. It's just the singular, the inspiration. Together, they create a bouquet of solutions on transportation. So we'll start over here, and we'll end with Thomas. What is a singular practical solution in the transport space that can transform it right now? Dessima.
Oh my goodness.
It's like a game show.
Yes. Well, first of all, tomorrow is Climate Justice Day. And climate justice means that we must put people and their rights at the center of all climate decisions and actions. That's all that it means. So you're all climate justice champions. And in that spirit, I propose that renewables become the mainstay of the transportation system in every single sector. And that is in the transportation world, of course. And that means that whether you're doing, big across Europe trucking, whether you're doing aviation across the world, whether you're doing, there are limits to global aviation, but if you're doing sea transport in the islands, if you're doing tuk-tuk transport in the big cities or taxis, that we can go electric, we can go solar, we can go renewables. It should be a universal movement to go solar. Solar is a shorthand for renewable, but I think that we could transform the transportation system to a very, very large extent. Perhaps the limitations might be only or mainly in aviation, but in land transport, electric cars, I have seen solar panels on water taxis. So we could do that while each of us as a human being, take an action to either walk more, bicycle more, change our transportation system at a personal level. And I want to give compliments to all the people here at this COP23 who are walking and taking bicycles long distances instead of taking cars, even electric cars and transport.
Excellent.
And finally, all of that will be possible, or will be more possible, if in fact the $100 billion commitment is on the table. We can't make that transition without a lot of national, Mozambican and other domestic commitments to the transportation budgets and the transportation sector as a whole. And at the same time, we need those catalytic and leveraging public support for the domestic and the international private sector. So renewables all the way, personal and institutional.
Excellent. And some personal commitments and some finance. You kind of slipped 3 in there, but I'll let it slide too. That was a good one. Thank you, Dessima. Excellent. Okay. Short and sweet, what can transform the transport sector now?
A target on international maritime transport. They're the only ones left out right now. They're not covered by anything. And carbon pricing could be considered in that sector.
Okay. Thanks.
Not just saying.
Thanks so much, Kelley. Great.
Well, I have a dream. I have a dream. In the north of Chile, close to border from Peru, Bolivia, and Argentina, we have the largest lithium reserves that we need to build batteries. And close to this place, we have the largest copper reserves that we need to build vehicles, electric vehicles. So my dream is have, of course, the Latin American largest factory of electric vehicles for the developing countries.
Electric vehicles from
Course.
your region. Got it. Okay, that's a good dream.
Well, mine is easy. We already said it. Show me the money. I think it's essentially work with the private sector to drive investment for climate-smart transport.
Excellent. Yes, I think everyone's looking for all of these solutions, actually, so that's fantastic. Thank you so much. Tomorrow night is our last night. This was an excellent way. We're nearing the end of COP. You can feel it in the air. Paris was outstanding, and now we're all working towards implementation. There are so many outstanding examples that every night we're hearing, and the COP is full of them as well, so it's really wonderful to have you all here to speak about it. If you have questions for our last show tomorrow night, it's #WeAreTransport. Thanks to our wonderful guests, thanks to our team for pulling this together, thanks to DHL for hosting us here, PPMC, the Paris Process on Mobility and Climate, which is Michelin moving on, and SLoCaT for pulling this all together. Outstanding. And good luck to everybody who still has work to do. Another day. Thank you. Bye.